The company's insurance doesn't cover sentiment, Ms. Moreno, only performance. The voice was deep yet cold, like a polished blade slicing through the golden air of the Seraphine's grand hall. Maxwell Kane leaned close, his lips almost brushing Isla Moreno's ear. He didn't need to raise his voice. A whisper was enough to drown her in isolation right in the middle of a sea of people laughing and clinking champagne glasses. His smile gleamed like his Italian silk tie, but his eyes held no trace of warmth. The room glittered with splendor. Polished mahogany reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers. The clinking of cutlery composed an elegant backdrop, and immaculate white napkins were folded with geometric precision. At every table, half-whispered conversations laced with pride continued writing the chapters of Wall Street, Manhattan real estate, and million-dollar deals. For more than half a century, the Seraphine had remained the sanctuary of the Upper East Side elite. Yet within this dazzling canvas, Isa, dressed in a plain black and white uniform, moved like a dancer with broken wings. Her right arm was strapped in a black medical brace, hidden under fabric, yet still revealing its rigidity. Every motion pouring wine, setting cutlery, balancing a tray was forced upon her left hand. Her slender fingers trembled slightly as she struggled to hold the heavy bottle of Bordeaux. When the brace brushed against the edge of a table, a faint wince flickered across her face, only to be swallowed immediately by her professional smile. That smile was like varnish on ancient wood, polished on the surface, concealing cracks. Beneath, in a distant corner, beneath oil paintings and gilded mirrors, an old man sat quietly with a cup of black coffee. Edward Whitmore. No one in the room recognized him as the founder of the Seraphine. To them, he was just a silver-haired gentleman in a worn tweed coat, utterly out of place amid the grandeur. But Edward wasn't looking at the menu. He was observing. He noticed the soulless jazz playlist replacing the classical pieces his wife, Margaret, once chose to weave the restaurant's spirit. He noticed staff rushing about with fear etched in every step, rather than the pride that had once built the house's reputation. He noticed the new lights too bright, too cold stripping away the gentle glow of candlelight from long ago. And above all, he noticed Isla. Her fragile yet resilient presence reminded him of Margaret, the woman who once stood in a steam-filled kitchen, hands shaking from illness, yet still smiling as she mopped the floors after a long night. Isla bore that same quiet dignity, enduring without complaint, clinging to grace. Laughter rang from the right-hand table, a wealthy family of 4 demanding to be moved. No staff dared hesitate. Isla, alongside a young busboy, bent to lift the heavy porcelain plates from the table. The tray wobbled against her thin left arm, as fragile as a branch about to snap. One plate tilted, clinking sharply. It didn't fall, but it almost did. Maxwell appeared at once. He didn't shout. He placed a hand on Isla's shoulder, feigning a gesture of protection. Yet the weight of his fingers froze her blood. His voice was gentle but loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "We aim for flawlessness here, Ms. Moreno, not almost." That touch, pretending to be kind, was in truth a blade of warning. Isla bowed her head, lips pressed tight, offering no defense. The chandelier light reflected off the black brace on her arm, turning it into a mark of failure in the eyes of onlookers. Edward's grip tightened around his coffee cup until his knuckles whitened. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "We didn't build the Seraphine to be a gilded cage. We built it to be a home, no matter who walked through its doors." Yet now, all that remained was a glittering shell inside it, fear and cruelty plated in gold. Isla retreated behind the bar, taking a deep breath, closing her eyes, trying to smother the pain flaring in her arm and the sting of humiliation. One long breath, as though grasping for the last bit of air in a heavy chest. The room still brimmed with light and laughter, but for Isla, it had become a cage of gold. Every step she took, the mahogany floor echoed like shackles. And from the far corner, Edward watched, silent, in his eyes, sorrow slowly folded into a quiet, smoldering flame. The velvet curtain had just risen. The play of imprisoned souls had begun. The faint clink of crystal rang out like a tap on glass. That afternoon, Thomas Beckett, the New York Times food critic, sat at the VIP table near the window. A man in his 50s, dressed in a navy suit cut to precision, his pocket square folded, as if by a ruler. He didn't just eat, he judged. A single raised brow from him could send a restaurant into decline. Maxwell Kane circled the table with exaggerated attentiveness. His smile stretched wider than usual, almost syrupy. "We are honored to have you here, Mr. Beckett. We'll make sure every experience is flawless." He stressed the last word like a dagger aimed at Isla Moreno, who was preparing to uncork the vintage Bordeaux Beckett had ordered. Isla lifted the bottle, her left hand gripping its neck while her right remained locked in its brace. Her body was that of a tightrope artist, one slight tremor, and everything could collapse. Tilting the bottle, she tried to keep the wine flowing smoothly into the crystal glass, but her injured arm twitched, faintly imperceptible to anyone but herself, and a drop of red, as vivid as blood, fell onto the pristine white tablecloth. The air froze. One drop, but it spread like a crack across porcelain. Thomas Beckett looked up, his cold eyes fixed on the stain. He said nothing. He simply arched an eyebrow and set the glass back down. Maxwell swooped in at once, a predator catching the scent of blood. Instead, he smiled, bowed apologetically to Beckett, and signaled for the staff to change the tablecloth. The motions were quick, efficient, seamless. But then he drew out a tablet, its screen lighting up in front of Isla. "Documentation is key to improvement." His voice carried just enough for nearby tables to hear. Each tap of his finger on the glass screen was a cold strike, turning Isla's slip into a permanent digital indictment. She stood tall, offering no defense, while whispers spread from surrounding tables. The humiliation was not in his words, but in the act. Maxwell had turned a single drop of wine into an indelible stain, inscribed in record. In the far corner, Edward Whitmore sat frozen. He remembered Margaret, who once spilled an entire glass of champagne onto a senator's suit. No report was filed. She had laughed, apologized, ordered another bottle, and turned it into a story that made the whole table raise their glasses. The room had erupted in applause. That was the difference between management and leadership. Edward sipped his coffee, but the bitterness suddenly tasted harsher. From a nearby table, a woman rose. Evelyn Harrington, a wealthy widow, had her. Silver hair pinned high, pearls gleaming at her throat. She had once been a regular, once laughed with Margaret at that very corner table. She drew up a chair across from Edward, not recognizing him. They would never have done this in Margaret's time. Her voice was low, husky, but heavy with regret. The Seraphine once had kindness. It once had grace. Edward tilted, his head slightly. Each word pierced him deeper. "Back then," Evelyn continued, "the staff had a scholarship fund, then Margaret Whitmore Fund. My son received that scholarship to study music at Juilliard. Now, I never hear it mentioned." "I wonder, does it even exist anymore?" Edward did not reply. He stared into the bottom of his coffee cup. Reflected in the liquid was the portrait of Margaret hanging at the end of the room. Her eyes seemed to meet his, questioning. As the restaurant emptied, Edward caught the eye of a familiar dishwasher. Caleb Johnson, the boy he had once taken. In years ago, Caleb froze, then sighed, eyes reddening. "Mr. Whitmore?" he whispered. "You've really come back?" Edward nodded. Caleb swallowed hard. "You need to know, Kane. He's fired almost all the old staff." Scared, he cut bonuses, docked pay, and forced overtime without wages. And the fund, the Margaret Fund. His voice dropped, trembling. He said it was on hold, but everyone knows the money's gone. The words poured gasoline onto the embers burning in Edward's chest. That night after the restaurant closed, Edward sat alone in the darkness of the bar, staring at Margaret's portrait. It was no longer mere sorrow. It was a cold, precise fury. He set down his coffee cup, his hand trembling but his gaze unwavering. This was no longer about a restaurant. It was a battle to reclaim justice and Margaret's legacy. The crash of shattering glass rang out, slicing through the air like a blade tearing silk. A new Hera, frail blonde, boy stared in horror at the pile of broken crystal on the floor, his face drained white. Everyone paused, waiting for the reaction. Isla Moreno bent down first, not Maxwell Kane. Her voice was soft but steady. It's just glass. We're not. She gathered the shards piece by piece, her slender hands moving. Carefully, unafraid of cuts. Her face remained composed, offering a smile to the boy as though turning the accident into a gentle lesson. From the far corner, Edward Whitmore sat frozen. The scene hurled him back 15 years, Margaret, after a long shift, so exhausted. She coughed blood, yet still knelt to scrub the steam-filled kitchen floor. She had looked up at him, smiled, and whispered hoarsely, "It's just a stain, Eddie. We're not." Those words, that image, now lived again before his eyes. In Isla, it wasn't pity he felt, but recognition. She carried Margaret's spirit, resilient yet kind. The next day, Edward didn't remain idle. He began calling former staff. Each call cut like a blade. A veteran waiter recalled how Maxwell docked his pay for walking too slowly. A chef said he was forced to buy cheap ingredients while invoices were padded. A former shift manager, voice-breaking, told how he was fired for protesting the theft of tips. Edward listened, took notes. He was no longer a king in exile. He was gathering weapons. He called his lawyer. Audit the Margaret Whitmore Fund. For me, when the results came back, his blood boiled. Maxwell had siphoned money from the fund, disguised as administrative expenses, and funneled it through a shell company. Not just ruthless, he was a thief. That evening, Isla worked the late shift. After 12 hours on her feet, her eyes were heavy, her left hand trembling. When a wealthy guest left his wallet on the table, Isla ran after him, bursting into the misty New York night. Rain lashed her face, soaking her shirt until it clung cold against her skin. She handed back the wallet. The guest gave only a curt nod, not a word of thanks. Isla returned drenched, shivering, her hair plastered with rain. At the doorway, Maxwell blocked her path. He wasn't smiling now. He held a piece of paper, his voice dry. "Your injury has become a liability. Your performance today with the wine incident. It's just not the Seraphine standard. Pack your things." Isla stood still. Her eyes did not spill tears. She did not beg. She was silent, like a statue already cracked, the last spark in her gaze extinguished. Edward Whitmore saw everything. In that instant, he knew. He could deal with this quietly, call the board. Sue Maxwell, settle behind closed doors. But Margaret would never have done that. She would have stood right there and defended what was right. Edward set down his coffee cup. He rose. Each slow step echoed across the mahogany floor, every sound like a drumbeat summoning a storm. The murmurs died. Guests turned their heads. Staff froze. He didn't walk toward Maxwell, nor toward Isla. He moved to the center of the room beneath the crystal chandelier, as if a ghost had stepped out of the portrait hanging on the wall. The air thickened. Silence crushed the room. Everyone felt it. A storm was about to break. Over the Seraphine. "Can I help you, sir?" Maxwell Kane's voice rang out, irritated yet wrapped in a professional smile. He had just signed Isla Moreno's dismissal papers, only to turn back and find an old silver-haired man standing in the center of the dining hall, out of place amidst the opulence. Edward Whitmore did not answer immediately. His eyes swept the room, guests stiff in their seats, staff frozen in place, and Isla, pale, still clutching the termination notice. He drew in a long breath. His voice emerged, deep and unwavering. "You can start by telling me what the Seraphine standard is." The air thickened. Maxwell arched a brow, then gave a derisive laugh. "Excellence. Something you wouldn't understand." Edward stepped toward him, the chandelier's light carving his gaunt face. He repeated slowly, "Excellence? Tell me. Does excellence involve firing an employee for an act of honesty?" He pointed at Isla, still damp from the rain, still holding the wallet she had just returned. "Does excellence involve humiliating your staff for a single drop of wine?" At the VIP table, Thomas Beckett shifted. "Oh." The critic gave a slight nod, confirming he had witnessed it all. The murmurs swelled, sparks racing across dry tinder. Edward lifted his head, his voice sharpening to steel. "And does excellence involve embezzling from a charity fund named after my dead wife?" The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Evelyn Harrington slammed her champagne glass onto the table. Staff glanced at one another, eyes shifting from fear to hope. Maxwell's face drained white. Who do you think you are? Edward didn't shout. From his pocket, he drew out an old brass key, worn yet gleaming under the chandelier. He held it aloft. 35 years ago, I used this key to open the Seraphine for the first time. My wife Margaret was by my side. We built this place not on flawless service, but on a promise that everyone who walks through that door, staff or guest, would be treated with dignity. He stepped closer, his eyes blazing, his voice carrying. You broke that promise. Defiled her memory. You are not the Seraphine. I am. The silence was shattered. Harrington rose. Beckett stood. Caleb Johnson emerged from the kitchen, soap still clinging to his hands. One by one, staff stepped forward, circling Isla, forming a silent shield of solidarity. Maxwell's gaze darted around the room, panic rising. This is ridiculous. He's just some old man. But not a soul turned from Edward. He turned to Isla, not with condescension but with recognition. Ms. Moreno. What you showed here tonight, grit, integrity, grace under pressure, that is the Seraphine standard? Isla raised her head. For the first time, her eyes glimmered with something new, to be seen, to be acknowledged. Edward pivoted back to Maxwell, his voice the final blade. As for you, you're fired. And my lawyers will be in touch with you and the parent company regarding the Margaret Whitmore Scholarship Fund. Security will see you out. 2 guards advanced. Maxwell flailed, shouting, You'll regret this.
Oh, you all will regret?
The heavy wooden door slammed behind him, cutting his voice short. The room trembled, but not with fear. The air lightened, as though a storm had passed, and the sky cleared. Isla clenched the termination slip in her hand, then slowly released. Her chest heaved once, then steadied. For the first time in months, she inhaled deeply in it, to stifle herself. But to breathe in freedom. After the heavy wooden door closed, the Seraphine sank into a strange stillness. There was no suffocating whisper, no round of applause. Only relief, a collective exhale, like the air after a storm when the sky turns clear. Edward Whitmore walked toward Isla Moreno. The termination slip was still crumpled in her rain-soaked fingers. He gently took it, tore it in half, and dropped it into the trash. The dry rip of paper rang sharp, but to Isla, it sounded like music. Of release. Go home, Isla, Edward said, his voice softer than ever. Rest that arm, heal. She looked at him, lips trembling. I don't know what to say, he smiled. Don't say anything. Just come back tomorrow, or the day after. Not as a waitress, but as my new floor manager. We need to teach this place how to be graceful again. And I think you're the best teacher I could ask for. Her eyes brimmed, but this time the tears were not of humiliation or pain. They were of hope, feeling she thought long dead. Edward turned to the gathered staff. They stood, waiting, hesitant, like birds just freed from a cage but unsure if freedom was real. He raised his voice. The Seraphine is closed for the rest of the night. A few guests looked surprised, but no one objected. Continued. The kitchen, however, is open. For family? Shock rippled through the room, then smiles spread. The head chef let out a laugh. Staff exchanged bewildered glances, then relaxed. The closure was not punishment. It was a rebirth. Edward gestured. Bring out the best of everything. Tonight we don't serve. We share. The scene transformed. Its tables once reserved for the elite now overflowed with food from the kitchen. Fragrant beef bourguignon, Rockefeller oysters, garlic butter toast, even rare wines usually uncorked only for guests paying thousands. Staff sat down, awkward at first, then broke into laughter as they became guests in their own house. Caleb Johnson sat beside the head chef, eating as tears streamed down his face. A young waiter wrapped an arm around the nervous boy who had broken the glass earlier, teasing him like a brother. Evelyn Harrington sipped her champagne, eyes shining. The This feels like the old days, she whispered, almost to herself. Isla sat beside Edward. She didn't eat much. Instead, she looked around the room. Laughter, clinking silverware, the golden warmth of chandelier light tit was all transformed. From what it had been just hours before, it's no longer a gilded cage, but a home. With her good hand, she pulled a pen from her pocket and sketched quickly on a napkin. A large hand resting on the shoulder of a smaller one, the image Edward had just given her. Edward glanced down and saw the sketch. He smiled, a real smile. This time, unhidden. Margaret would have loved you. Isla looked up. Single tear rolled down her cheek, but her lips curved into a smile. A smile of release, of dignity reclaimed. Above them, the chandelier blazed brighter. As if orchestrating harmony with the moment, the imaginary camera pulled back, out through the Seraphine's window. From the street, the room glowed like a beacon in New York's drizzling night. Inside, a new family had been reborn, sharing not only food but also renewed faith and kindness. The screen faded to black. The first note of a new song had begun. Do you see it? In a world where false perfection is worshipped, sometimes a single drop of wine is enough to strip it all bare. Isla Waitress, with her arm in a brace, showed us that true dignity doesn't lie in flawless appearances, but in holding on to grace even when crushed. And Edward, the aging founder, thought to have retreated into the shadows, reminded us that the greatest legacy is not a glittering restaurant, but a promise of kindness to people. When justice is served, when kindness is restored, the Seraphine is no longer just a restaurant. It becomes a new symphony, where every person has value, is seen, and is worthy of respect. And what about you? Have you ever been judged for a single mistake while all your effort was overlooked? And if you were in that room, would you have stood with Maxwell? Or dared to stand with Isla? Share your story in the comments. We want to hear your voice. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Toch Stories so you won't miss the tales that touch the heart, the stories that remind us kindness will always have a voice of its own.